Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Wisdom Factory. I'm Heidi Hörnlein, and I'm sitting here in Italy with two guests in Turkey. I mean, this is not my guest, but it's my co-host, Martin Utschig, and with our guest, Geoff Fitch, not Finch, Fitch. Okay, I got it right. And our topic today is how individuals and collectives can evolve together. But before we go into the topic, into the content, I would like you to introduce yourself. And first, my co-host, Martin.
Hello, everyone. So for those who don't know me, I'm the integral relationship guy who wrote 2 books on integral relationships, and am a fan of Ken Wilber's work since 2006, so not that long compared to some other people, but very immersed. And right now I'm in Istanbul actually for the last 6 months, and we have quite a group here of integral relationship explorers with weekly meetings and workshops and training. So it's very exciting to bring this to this emerging culture here in Turkey. And I hope I will be a little taller by the end of the session, because Geoff will help us all to grow together.
Thank you, Martin. It's really glad to be here, and really happy to have this conversation with you. Again, my name is Geoff Fitch. I'm from Pacific Integral. I'm one of the co-founders of Pacific Integral and the Generating Transformative Change program, which has been kind of one of our central projects for the last 15 years. It's a deep integrally informed development program that has been our kind of ongoing experiment and exploration of the evolution of consciousness and action in the world. And this has been happening since 2014. We've run it on 3 different continents, and are just this year starting our 30th program. So it's an integral program that's been in existence for some time and has really gained a deep experience and maturity in its application. And for me, I've been working as a coach and consultant and counselor, teacher in this kind of work for the past 20 years. I'm a father of 2 adult children, and that's been a big part of my learning experience, and a musician. And before doing this kind of work, I worked in business in the technology world. So just have a lot of different interests, happy to be here and talk to you a little bit about what we've learned in this work.
Yeah, thank you. And first, I would like to ask you, how did you come into Integral? Because this is my question today. How can we get people to recognize Integral and then apply that? And I find it interesting how people get into it.
Yeah, well, it is really interesting. It's and my own view of that, I'll tell you personally, but my own view of it is I tend to think of Integral primarily as a kind of leading edge of consciousness, as a kind of evolutionary stage, and so the question of how I got into Integral is like, how do we get into any of those stages? We're our circumstances and our natural development just sort of force us into that perspective. But in terms of Ken Wilber's work, I was already in the kind of midst of a lifelong exploration of my own growth and development, which, for most of us is driven by my own suffering and confusion and restlessness. And I remember at one point I came across one of Ken's books. I don't remember which one it was, before I was really ready to see it. And it just looked like, like I was looking at the Windows user manual or something like that. I mean, it just didn't make any sense to me at all. And then later on, I think when I had kind of, come towards an integral perspective already, I came across this work, and that's what, a lot of people have this kind of story of reading and going like, oh, this makes so much sense. And for me, the first book that really I latched onto was The Marriage of Sense and Soul. And I saw that, and I had spent years developing my own, my own kind of spiritual, psychological growth, and interested in the interiors. And my father was a doctor and a very rational person. And I read that book and I thought, oh, this is the answer to the argument that I've been having in my head with my father all these years about this stuff. Wow. So I bought the book and read it very intentfully.
This is really interesting, and it's right that when you come when you read it and you are ready, then you say, "Oh, that's what I sort of knew, but never knew how to say it." No? That's interesting.
Right.
So, Martin, do you want to ask something else, or shall we have him jump into his topic?
Yeah, you got to jump in, or have him jump in. I'll stay outside. Let him jump in.
Yeah, and I really hope this is this is a conversation, and I'm really interested to hear what you all think and what questions are on your mind too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think I think where I'd like to start is I think the topic was how individuals and collectives develop together. And I think it's a really good place to start, just to reflect a little bit on, the question of to what end, the why. And I remember seeing Brother David Stendhal-Ross at IEC this year, and he had this sort of the why and the what and the how is his, just pithy distillation of the spiritual path. And what I loved is he said the why always takes us to silence. And so here I am asking the why, as if there's an answer to that, really. But to me, it is part of it's an important part of our consideration about development. And to me, our work has been really, over time, has evolved into just a sense of care for the whole. It's really, even though what we're doing is relatively modest in the grand scheme of things, we're operating out of an instinct of care for our common humanity, for our point in our history here, to the larger human systems, to the experiences of injustice and ecological decline that we're working with at a planetary level right now. And so I just want to say, as we talk about development, because development can often kind of be very personal and is ultimately always very personal, we're also holding a larger kind of universal perspective about it. So our work originally, just a little bit of background about it. I mean, our work originally was seated in this awareness and focused on supporting the development of people in the world who see themselves as leaders, as engaging, as change agents in various different walks of life, who have a sense of their life being part of a larger story. Their a desire or impulse to express a larger sense of care in the world, have an impact in our larger social sphere, or in a transformative nature in the people that they're working with. So, and as we begin to work with this, we begin to kind of conceive of this evolutionary moment that we're in as something that we could contribute to in this work. So I just wanted to mention that kind of expression of values, or the ethical orientation of the work.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm interested in how it goes. So you probably started out as you are a coach, and started out with working with single people. So the development of the individual. And then how did you get them together? How did that start?
Well, the program was originally primarily founded by myself and Terry O'Fallon and Dana Carmen and someone named Joseph Friedman. And we were a mixture of people who have kind of worked with people individually and also collectively, mostly in organizational context. Terry is a lifelong educator of all levels of education. And so we did have an orientation towards how to work with collectives from the individual perspective. But what ended up happening is we structured our work as a kind of longer term developmental process. The program's now 9 months long, but originally it was longer. It's been in forms of up to 2 years, 18 months. And over time, we've kind of intensified it and shortened it. But it's a cohort-based program, so we're working with collectives. And initially, we saw that as a kind of learning context. But then as we evolved and ultimately became more influenced by Theory U and the work of Otto Scharmer, looking at transformative processes in groups, we began to see about the interplay between individual and collective, and how both working at the collective level and the individual level, you could say initially is just important, but also seeing, in a more nuanced way, how the individual and the collective are always influencing each other and interpenetrating with each other ultimately. Now, the other aspect of this I just want to touch on is that early on in the program, we decided to focus on development in the sense of adult developmental theory that's included in the integral model, and to do research in the program in this form. Initially we did a little bit of work with spiral dynamics, and then Suzanne Cook-Reuter's model, and ultimately the Terry's stages theory grew out of this experience. So from very early on in the program, we've been doing longitudinal developmental research. So this is everybody who comes into the program takes a developmental assessment, and then we follow them and take an assessment every 2 years after they leave the program, and just track how their development is happening. And this has been part of our orientation, is just to try to get a really embodied, connected sense of what these developmental stages are, how they grow, how they move over time. And in that work, the work that Terry was doing to develop the stages model really gave us some insights about this connection between the I and the we. And so I think I'll just touch a little bit on that. One important thing is, I'm going to refer to some distinctions from that framework, which of course, there's many different frameworks, and this is one, but it does reveal some particular things about I and we. And in the stages model, it defines kind of 3 tiers, which are called the concrete, subtle, and meta-aware tier. And these are kind of roughly equivalent to the domains of concrete, subtle, and body, mind, and spirit, you could say. And what also distinguishes that is that this isn't just an evolution of the self, but it's an evolution of the we. And for, in a way that I haven't really seen elsewhere, it really defines how that understanding of the we evolves. So in what we understand from that is...
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, what we understand for that, we all kind of know from the developmental framework that, we kind of started egocentric and grow to ethnocentric. And that ethnocentric is our first kind of understanding that we're actually in a collective, that the human beings around us aren't just, pleasant objects, that they're actually looking back at us and have a perspective on us, and that we know that we're being watched. So we're part of this collective. But what we understand now is that that's a concrete, what we call a concrete collective, which is really the sort of visible we. So we're having an emotional experience in that space, but the way we understand that is family, organization, community, the we that we can point to, right? And then as we grow into the third person perspective, or what we could say orange in Wilber's scheme, we begin to have a subtle mind, but we're still in the concrete we. We have thoughts and feelings and abstract ideas, but we talk about them with our people, right? And we don't necessarily understand that they understand us in the way we understand ourselves, but we have that concrete collective. Then it, roughly in what we might think of as the pluralist stage, the subtle we starts to take shape. So we understand that there's a whole territory of collective that's not seen, not visible. So, and that's context, systems, cultures, energies, this kind of hidden we. And this is where the idea of like we space starts to arise. So it's not so much, my collective isn't so much just, Heidi or Martin. It's the context in which we can have a certain kind of connection. That's really where I find community. And I can have, I still have a concrete collective, you two are still my friends, but if you're not available and I can create that space with some other people, I can have that experience of we. So that's the more subtle we that's not really dependent on the particular collective that we're in. And that's the subtle we space that we create.
Yeah, and it's not only a collection of people sitting together, but it is a sort of recognition, a felt or intuitive recognition that we are in a certain quality of free space. Because when we are just sitting together in a business meeting, I don't think we would call that in our terms a we space. We want to have the other.
Yeah, exactly. It's actually the hidden subtle contexts and field systems. These are kind of words that we might use to point to the subtle we. And what's really important at that stage, at pluralist and green, teal, and beyond, is the quality of that we space. So just like when we go through from early ethnocentric up through modern or orange, we're developing our capacity for concrete collectives, what we call concrete collective, which is the visible, everything from the playground to the modern enterprise, right? We have a whole evolution of that. Here we begin to have an evolution of what's the subtle space that we're in? How can we form that? How can we frame it? What questions do we ask? And you're right, it's not just a group of people together. Still seems to require a group of people, but we can also kind of do it in our imagination. It's much more subtle. So that's the kind of second we that arises. And just like with the first one, when you get halfway through that, a new I gets formed. And that happens in the we space when we begin to grow into turquoise and have a sense of ourselves as awareness itself, a kind of more transpersonal self. And then that becomes, the selves having this more refined experience of the ground of being, of awareness itself inside that subtle we space. So this is the kind of movement between I and we that occurs as we evolve. Just pause and see if either of you have a comment or a question.
So in my mind, that pretty much covered the upper left and lower left quadrant, the I quadrant and the V quadrant. Right? Do you also integrate in some different ways the right-hand quadrants?
Yeah. So what I'm really pointing is more the dance between the upper and the lower quadrants. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how
do you see these evolve in that context?
Can you ask your question again?
how do you see the right-hand quadrants evolve in that which is maybe you can speak to how you define the left and right and upper and lower quadrants.
Yeah. I mean, so we're talking about the polarity between the individual and collective, and the interior and the exterior. Yeah. Well, each of these, self and we has an experience, has an interior experience and an exterior manifestation. So as you move through these contexts, through these stages of development, both of those are evolving at the same time. So there's different forms and structures that take place in our awareness of those forms and structures, and our interior experience.
I mean, I sometimes have a little.
Example. Yeah. Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I sometimes have a little bit of a beef with people who are very focused on these we-space groups and authentic relating and things like that, because they often their relationships don't extend into the right quadrants, and when they try to extend it into the right quadrants, like in my sphere of interest, into their sexuality and living together, sharing, home and money and things, often these well-intended intentions that are set in the groups where these things are not shared break down pretty quickly. Right. And then I see that a bit as uneven development, or sometimes even as a compensation to be in these larger e-space groups in the widest contracts, to compensate for the lack of some of these people for having healthy relationships in the right quadrants as well. Yeah. So no, that's I would I love what you're saying, Martin, and to me it's also really important. I want to leave the quadrants out for a minute, just because I think there's something else you're pointing to that I might speak to differently. But one is you mentioned money and sex. Yes, these are the two, right? It's time, money, and sex, which people usually struggle with the most. Yeah. So there's as we're evolving. I mean, so money and sex. We invented money and sex at an earlier developmental stage than these sort of more rarefied stages. Right. So it's sex much earlier than money, for that matter. Yeah. Well, we probably invented possessions at a pretty earlier stage. We might have abstracted them, but so maybe sex and stuff, you could say, to get it even more visceral. So part of what I hear you say is speaking to a kind of shadow element, or kind of earlier stages of development being mature and integrated. And just as a kind of principle, so let's step out of the evolution of I and we for a moment and just speak to, like, what are healthy principles of development? And you're kind of pointing to a little bit of being imbalanced, or bypassing, or compensating, and those kinds of things. And obviously in development, we can engage, we can bypass in numerous ways. As long as there's a way to get around something difficult, human beings will find it and exploit it as long as they can. And so all of this, evolved integral stuff just provides more ways to get around the tough things in some sense. But so that, you're pointing to kind of earlier stages. And to me, it's really important that we, in a sense, anytime we talk about a movement in a certain direction, the conversation will inevitably turn to the opposite direction. So if we're talking about vertical growth, and I was kind of talking about that,
the conversation has got to turn to, but yeah, but what about all this stuff that we've left beside the road on the way, and our shadows? And so my orientation is to be inclusive of that, to be really cautious that in any sense of what our development or evolution is that we watch for how we reduce it, because we obviously miss things when we do that. And so part of what you're saying to me speaks to being healthy in our earlier stages. So an intention here is to be healthy at every stage of growth. And most of our work, transcending is kind of the easier part in a sense, because it's just stepping up to the next stage. But the including is this sort of ever lifelong work, because the more we live and the more we move through life, the more there is to include in a way. So that's important. The other thing that you pointed to me is you could say interior and exterior, but it's also, to me, just the space of experience versus the space of being in the world. It's to me, one of my teachers, likes to say that the measure of our realization is our conduct. And to me, that points to, it's a kind of traditional expression of it, but it points to that when we do development, we create something in ourselves, but it's just as important how we show up in the world, what impact we have on the world, how we deal with life, how we deal with our communities, what difference are we making in the world? Are we a good human being? Are we kind to each other? Are we responsible for what life has given us to handle? These, to me, are profoundly important questions. So this is how I respond to your point.
Thank you.
Oops. Yeah, I wanted to add.
I win the bell with that answer.
Yes. I want to come back a little bit to what Martin said about the difference, the V spaces, when they are created in this deep felt way with people who have no deep relationship, at least no romantic relationship and no sexuality. And the other, it seems sometimes, and I heard psychologists say that people who are married and in a sexual relationships often have more difficulty to enter into such a V space than we have with other people. And you said it at the beginning, you can create this space, this feeling of being in a space with different people, that's not necessarily connected to a certain individual. So the question is, how can we create something like that also in our personal relationships, in families, and as partners? Yeah. But I don't know if you wanted to continue first to tell a little bit more about your things. But
let me just complete the framing of the evolution of I and we, so that that's done. So we're moving through concrete, subtle, and what we're calling meta-aware tier, which is kind of you could say the equivalent of body, mind, and spirit, or our understanding of the world through the senses, the world through the subtle abstract mind, and the world through awareness itself. And the message that I just will repeat is that we evolve into the experience of these territories as I, we, we. And so we're deepening our understanding of the self. And then once we oriented on understanding ourself, we realize there's other selves at that stage. So that starts at the concrete level of I have a self, and then I realize there's other concrete selves. I have a subtle self at orange, and then I realize at green and teal that there's a subtle we. And then at turquoise, I have a sense of myself as awareness itself, the aspect of myself, which is this boundless awareness of awareness itself. And then eventually there's a meta-aware we, which is through our research is understood as reality itself, manifestation itself. So I find myself in a we space, which really consists of everything altogether. And so those are the markers of the evolution in this framework of I and we. And so I just wanted to complete that. And since we've been talking about we space, to say that where I see that is really in our model, that's kind of equivalent to this subtle we, which the interest in that and the exploration of that starts at green and it moves through, you could say, late turquoise, and that, and in our research after that, the interest in that kind of wanes into an understanding of ourselves as a kind of existence in this larger manifestation. And so that's just to complete that as a kind of framework. Now, glad I like your question about how do we bring this into our relationships, and I think it's in our work that I would say our exploration of the we practice. I mean, I think what you're pointing to a little bit is that in we space, you can kind of have a practice where there's a kind of state experience. Yeah. And
the feeling of being together in the same room, and the feeling also if somebody intrudes and this we space is interrupted. So that's a very clear perception.
Right. Yeah. Right. So, yeah. So we, in our work, we work with cohorts of, small groups of people, 12 to 16, 18 people who go very deep with each other over a 9-month period of time, and who often kind of continue to practice together. What I want to set aside, since it's in the room, that this deep feeling of connection with people as a kind of ultimate ideal. It's, to me, it's a profound experience, and it's an important part of our evolution, that we find this kind of more subtle, deep resonance with each other. And we could say, like, the downside of that, the potential unhealthy manifestation of that, is a kind of avoidance of the difficult stuff, right? That it becomes a happy place we go to. But the power of it is actually, if we can learn to sustain that experience of resonance with each other, it actually creates a space in which any of the difficult stuff can be brought in, to where if you think about it in a sense, Diane Hamilton speaks about the kind of polarity between sameness and diversity, or we would say unity and diversity. There's an experience that we have of unity, and if it's at the expense of diversity, in other words, conflict, different perspectives, different developmental levels, those kinds of things, different stories about what's happening. If it's at the expense of diversity, then it's not a fully integrated picture. But ultimately, those can become one. So I would say, to me, none of development itself is good if it comes at the expense of something important. So what you're pointing to is something really important here, that that when we get in the mess, in the midst of pain and confusion and our shadows and intimate relationships and close working relationships, our personal histories and our developmental trauma gets triggered, and all of that stuff is present, and yet if we add to it this deeper resonance with each other, but also with the ground of being, to me, in my experience, it creates a kind of openness and fluidity where that work can be done in a powerful way. So I just think that it, you know, just as a kind of, you know, practical wisdom is, you know, be honest with yourself about anything that you might be avoiding, and any ways that you might be deceiving yourself in your own development, and be wary of idealism. It's important to be idealistic, but also be wary of it.
I think there is Martin's work coming in here, because it seems to me that this is in an intimate relationship is only possible when people are more or less on the same stage, and the willingness to engage with certain practices like the ones you are offering. And otherwise, how can you do that? I really experienced that is one person enough in let's say 10 people to not destroy necessarily, but really interfere with this state experience of a we space, if they can disrupt it, let's say it in this way. So I think there needs to be the willingness to be in there and to explore it. What is your experience with that? Can you maybe give me an example of what you mean by people coming in and destroying the we space? I give you an example, and the experience is that even on internet, in conversations with a bunch of people, you can create this, you can be in this we space,
right?
And then there comes somebody in and says something, you know, really without any connection to the topic, and even presents himself as somebody we have to listen to him and something like that. And it's immediately, you know, it's getting on a different level, the meeting, which we were before. And I had that several times, this experience. So in a couple, it's even more. And that's why I bring Martin in, because if we choose the wrong, when we are, let's say, in teal and the other person is in, let's say red is too much, but
orange.
Orange is beginning of orange, then it can be a continuous fight, and we never reach, or maybe in sexual situations, but during the day, we hardly reach such a space of
mutual resonance or understanding. Even if the one person can hold the space for the other, it still makes the person at the earlier development often very uncomfortable, to put it mildly. And I struggle a little bit with that here too, in a way, you know, that to our events, a lot of women come who already have done a lot of personal growth work, but their male partners here in Turkey have not. And that is like this big issue of frustration here that I'm working with. No, and so even though one person can hold the space for the other one, the container is too big, and it creates discomfort, because they feel sort of like pressured. It's usually men, right, to live up to the perceived level of consciousness of the woman, for example. And so then what is that good for?
No, it's I'm just kind of feeling into the issue that you're bringing forth.
And that could be in an organization as well, right? Where some leaders do your program, and then they can approach things from a higher level of consciousness, but the rest of the employees may develop some resentment, and so like try to pull these people back down and say, you know, this whatever airy-fairy stuff you do there. We all love each other.
You know, I want to. This is really great question. I'm really appreciating it. You know, I want to step back, and I think I'm going to say something that maybe I'm asking to take on faith in a certain way. That there is a potential for a kind of a deeper resonance across developmental levels that doesn't have to do with the kind of communication that we want or the kind of emotional expression that we have. But there's a possibility for us to find a we across our ability to connect through language. And so I just want to suggest that and leave that as an inquiry. Now, the thing that you describe of that kind of, I mean, the internet is a really great example. I mean, I was just laughing when you were saying that, because it's kind of like you're describing just a typical day on the internet. You know, you're having some thought, and then something comes crashing in from the left field, and it's all destroyed. And so this kind of, as we become aware of this collective we space, we realize that it's a certain form of context. Right, there's a certain, there's subtle norms, there's a kind of orientation in the space. There's that whenever we're in any kind of we space, like any kind of coherent collective, it doesn't have to be what we think of as we space practice, but anytime there's a coherent collective, there's all sorts of things going on at a subtle level that support that. This is the territory of the lower quadrants. There's a kind of system that's in play. We have a kind of system that's in play between the three of us. I'm not going to just stand up and start singing the national anthem in the middle of our conversation. There's certain norms and practices that we're already engaging in that we're just presuming that are there.
And they are not really conscious. And sometimes it's difficult to really extrapolate them. In some cases in the past, we had to do that, because to get a person back into the rules, we first had to write down in language what the rules are, which we were following. That's
exactly. And there's those rules. In a subtle collective, there's also very subtle structures that happen. And so part of what you're describing when somebody sort of crashes in and changes the space is how does the collective actually integrate that phenomenon in a way that sustains a quality of coherence. Now, I'm just naming this, and we can start to think about it together. But what part of the work that we do is to help collectives become self-aware. In other words, there's a kind of, in the same sense that I can become self-aware, right? Like I can be engaged in something, and let's say writing something, and I'm engaged, and then something can come crashing into my mind. That like this guy who came into the internet, a memory from the past can come crashing in my mind and disturb what's happening. And I can become self-aware that, oh, that just happened. Where did that come from? I can find a way to integrate that experience in my own mind. Collectives can become self-aware too, so they can understand what the subtle spaces that they have, and it's a kind of meta conversation that can happen in a collective. And so then the collective can say like, oh, like I see that when something comes crashing in, it takes us out of our we space. How can we evolve that? Like in the mind, we can say, well, okay, let's keep people out like that out of the room. And with our mind, we do that for a while, but they keep crashing in, and then we realize, okay, there's something that needs to be integrated here to have us be more whole, a learning that needs to happen. So that's a kind of, the kind of collective evolution that can happen. That's not layering an ideal practice or form over a collective, but it's helping the collective become self-aware of its own subtle systems that are operating, and to engage in its own development through its own wisdom and insight as that happens. And, you know, part of that is there's collective shadow and working with that too. Maybe that person that's crashing into this space is some disowned element of the collective, and the collective can begin to look at that and to integrate that element. So that maybe gets a little taste of how we might work with, you know, collective evolution. And, you know, there's no, I'm giving like responses to this, but also these are all really unique situations, and we're all still learning.
What I'm interested now to know, are these groups you are leading, are they live or are they online?
They're both. They're both. Yeah. So we meet in a kind of deep residential retreat space for 4 or 5 days every 3 months, and then we're together online. And they're both practice spaces, but also spaces of emergence and action and leadership in the world. So the idea is really to bring out what we're working with and apply it in our families and communities and in our work and our creative expression in life. And so that's the kind of context. Yeah.
I have a question too.
Yeah.
Whenever you're ready.
Yeah.
Are you? Oh. I wonder how this, that's a kind of different question, how the stages model that you and Terry and the others developed over the years is different from the other, you know, spiral dynamics based or Levenger based and so on and so forth systems. Yeah. Is that kind of a synthesis, and how is it different?
Yeah. I'll you know, it's sort of a big topic, and I'll just express a few things that help distinguish it. But it grew out of the Levenger lineage, but integrated an insight that Terry had about how the primordial perspectives in the quadrants themselves are at the root of our development, and so it creates a kind of deeper structure to how perspective taking evolves in a human being. It's a kind of ego development framework, but it also, in a sense, integrates the quadrants. You could say, like, how do these perspectives? We're not born seeing the integral map in our mind. Somehow that developed over time, because the perspectives that, you know, because the perspectives that these primordial perspectives that we take evolve in our experience. So I've been kind of pointing to that and talking about these different stages of I and we. So one of the interesting things about that is it's also kind of predictive in a sense. It gives you a way of looking at what potentially at later stages, what perspectives might be taken. There has to be research through this, so that's important. But I would say so part of it is this kind of subtler, looking at the deeper structures and development that it reveals. A couple of other interesting things is, so one thing you could say, it's actually research on the quadrants too. It's actually looking at, oh, these things actually exist, and here's how they evolve in human consciousness. It distinguishes two later stages beyond the stages that Susan Cook-Reuter's model discovered. So there's a fuller picture of those kind of later stages that it reveals. And it's just ongoing research, and it's really Terry's work, and it's deeply informs what we're doing, because it kind of co-evolved with our own experience. What we're really focused more is on how this actually happens in life, in reality, and and how you can actually apply it and embody it. And so, but it informs deeply informs the work that we do. Yeah.
If I may, two more little questions.
Yeah.
From your perspective, what is the percentage, let's say in America, or at least on the West Coast and the East Coast and around Denver, of people who are, in integral and turquoise and these higher levels?
Yeah. That's a little question.
Because it's an ongoing discussion between me and Ken, and apparently some other people now.
Nobody really knows.
Yeah.
I mean,
and I would jump in here. I would say sometimes we are integral and sometimes we are not. So you cannot really say somebody is integral or is red or is blue. The center of gravity may be, but as Geoff Saltzman always says, in my best days, I'm blah, blah,
Right.
But there's we go up and down maybe, but there is a certain ceiling which we usually don't go beyond. So
I'll give you some impressions, but I don't think we really know what the percentage is, and I don't think we know what the significance of a percentage is. So to me, it's, in some sense, it's a kind of simple, it's a simple way to think about it, and it's an important way to think about it. But it's also, to me, I imagine that when we ask that question, and it's a question I've asked a lot too, and puzzled about, we're asking a question like something like, how are we doing in this world we're living in? It's like, how are we doing in our own collective development? It's not a question about I, but it's really a question about the larger world and society we live in. And to me, you're right in saying that, we have a kind of center of gravity, and we have earlier parts of ourselves, and that's true at the collective level too. So, maybe part of the question is kind of like, well, where is the collective at? And the trick for me that I always run into is that when you talk about collective in a larger social environment, it gets really complex. Like here in the U.S., to me, the cultural sphere is really situated in the sort of green teal territory quite strongly. The political sphere is much earlier. The power structures and the way that we're organized politically is much earlier. Certain areas of the country are really situated in green and somewhat integral, and other areas are in earlier stages. I would say as a society, we're in kind of a struggle between orange and green, here, and in kind of talking over a lot of the time. But in the cultural sphere, there are voices that are bringing more of an integral perspective, that are, to a certain degree. Obama did that. Jon Stewart did that. People like this who are the sort of cultural voices who, kind of from the meta-modern perspective, are bringing both irony and sincerity, and bringing the younger millennial generation here. A lot of those folks are really bringing a deeply practical and kind of evolutionary perspective. They're not, or revolutionary perspective. They're looking for something really beyond that kind of polarized dialogue that we're in. But at the same time, to me, the forces of there are lower right-hand quadrant structures that move against all of that. You mentioned the internet. To me, I grew up in technology in the 80s, and what we think of it as the internet is this sort of open democratic space. It's kind of a little bit an evolution into green, where we can actually all have our own voice. That to me has largely gotten disrupted, and so we now have a space in the internet where we can't create the context in which we communicate, and context is everything in communication. And so the context is sort of created for us, and so there's all of these forces to me playing in on this at the same time, so to me the question is complex, but it's a really good question, and we should just keep asking it and working with it and trying to understand it as best we can. One thing in our research, and in the stages research that I'm aware of, is that, in our, at least in the people that we come across, there's little difference regionally, in the planet, in terms of the availability of people at different developmental levels, whether what country or continent or place that we're coming from. There's a diversity of development all across the planet. That's my interpretation of that. But we have structures.
It's definitely not my experience in Turkey.
Yeah. No, I can understand that. I totally understand that. And it's not to say that there's the same diversity, but there's capacity at the different stages existing and able and available to be enacted. And yet, I think I'm just making that point just to point to the structures that are there that support it or don't enable it. So I'm not saying at a social level we're all at the same level, but at an individual level there's capacity available, and I think that's true here too.
So when people ask you at what level you are, what do you say? Because sometimes people ask me, and
I'm happy to talk about that, like individually in individual contexts, but not so much in a public context, just because it requires a little contextualization.
When people ask me in front of a group of 30 people, right here, when I teach these things. Yeah.
Well,
or give me a tip what a good answer is, so you don't have to out yourself.
I've been playing around, with this work and this, these territories for the last 20 years and exploring it, and so I have. I've been kind of unusual in that sense, and just, in my own development, and at the same time, it's not really what's in the forefront of life for me, right? I'm trying to, I'm trying to stay healthy and be a good father and a good husband, and clean out my garage and various things like that. And so, when I do that, then ask me.
You said at the beginning, it's more the behavior. And why do we need a label? It's when you answer the question, Martin, to people who you consider that they have let's say a lower developmental level, that always will seem like like arrogance, I would say.
Of course.
I personally would try to avoid it. But before we are at the end of the hour, I found that a very interesting conversation, and let's keep the inquiry ongoing, in my opinion, because it's really, that will be the future, how we get together and how we come together instead of fighting, but find a way to how do you say, to bring our gifts and what we can be and do into the collective and grow that together. And it's great what you are doing. Do you want to say to the end a little bit more about the course and how can people reach you and how can they participate?
Yes, yeah. So you can reach any of us. Reach me at pacificintegral.com, and the program's called Generating Transformative Change. It's being run actively in North America and in Australia and New Zealand right now. And just come. We have a program starting in Australia and New Zealand just in a month or so. So if you're down there and you hear this and want to join, get in touch with them. And I'd just love to be in contact. We have a lot of resources on our website too, videos and papers and things like that might be of interest to people. I'm just happy to connect with anybody who's interested in these topics. And yeah, thank you so much for the time. I really enjoyed speaking with both of you, and so appreciate your own sensibilities about what it is to grow and be human, and it's very, very lovely to speak with you both.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you to the viewers who have been here live and the ones who will be here in the future and listen to that. And we are offering still some more episodes in Conversations That Matter. Next time we will, on next Wednesday, we will call about the Connection Lab. It's always about connection. And come back and subscribe for our YouTube channel. And thank you. Martin, you want to say a closing word?
I'm just happy to share that I really liked how you described how the interior left and the exterior left kind of grow and interact with together. I found it very inspiring and added to my arsenal of explaining growth and development. So thank you for that gift, and also the work you do with Terry and the others in exploring these third tier consciousness levels, to which I had like 20 more questions, but that has to wait for another time.
Yeah.
And hopefully, I also hope that I can join one of your programs.
That would be great.
Someday.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's definitely on my bucket list.
Awesome.
Okay. Thank you, Geoff, and good luck with everything, and keep your energy up to do all this. That's really great. Thank you.
Thank you.